Welcome to those who are filing in. We will start in a moment. We are just waiting for the room to populate, but thank you for coming, and we will get started in a moment. All right, are folks still coming in? We will get started in a moment, just making sure folks are coming in. All righty. Well, welcome to today's webinar on adapting to climate change, economic and legal perspectives. For those of you that don't know me, I am Jonathan Adler. Among other things, I'm the director of the Coleman P. Burke Center for Environmental Law here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, which is sponsoring today's program. The Burke Center was founded in May of 2019 with a generous gift from our alum, the late Coleman Burke, and among other things, we produce a variety of programs on legal topics related to environmental law, and those programs are archived on our website for those that are interested. For those of you that are interested in climate change in particular, we co-sponsored an event last week on the challenges faced by the Arctic by climate change. That was co-sponsored with the Canada-US Law Institute. And last fall, we hosted Richard Lazarus of Harvard Law School giving a talk about his book, The Rule of Five, which talks about the Supreme Court's decision in Massachusetts versus EPA. And in May, on Tuesday, May 25th, we will be hosting a program on financial disclosure and financial markets and climate change with Professor Haverly from William & Mary and Professor Condon from Boston University, and information about that will be on our website as well. But today, we are here to talk about adaptation and the challenges of adapting to climate change. As I think viewers know, mitigation of the risks of climate change by reducing emissions is very much on the policy agenda. The Biden administration has announced a goal of reducing US emissions of greenhouse gases to 50% below 2005 levels over the next decade. Even if that goal is achieved and if other countries follow suit, there's a certain amount of warming already in the climatic system. And so some amount of adaptation will be the order of the day, whether we want it to be or not. And today I'm really pleased to be able to introduce two speakers that can help us untangle what's involved both from an economic and legal standpoint with regard to the challenges and perhaps opportunities of adapting to climate change. First, we are going to hear from Matthew Kahn, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Economics and Business and Director of the 21st Century Cities Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, and of particular relevance to today's topic, the author of the new book, Adapting to Climate Change, Markets and the Management of an Uncertain Future, which is published by Yale University Press. After Professor Kahn, we will then hear from Professor Robin Kundis Craig, who is currently the James I. Farr Presidential Endowed Professor of Law and the university's Distinguished Professor at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. And this July, she will be joining the faculty of the Gould School of Law at the University of Southern California. And she is, among other things, the co-author of a forthcoming article, 4 Degrees, which is not a happy title. That's co-authored with J.B. Rule, and I believe forthcoming in the Minnesota Law Review, but available now on SSRN for those of you that want an advanced peek. So you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Professors Kahn and Craig. And so I'm going to turn things over to Professor Kahn to start us off, to help us think about climate change adaptation and the economics of adaptation. How should we think about that? Professor Kahn, the floor is yours.
Jonathan, thank you. And Jonathan, as usual, I always learn from you. Robin, we're going to be colleagues at USC. I am returning to the University of Southern California. And so I'm delighted. So I'm hoping that today is the start of our discussion for the next 40 years about these issues. Folks, some people think I'm Quentin Tarantino in Los Angeles. That's not true. I'm an economist. My mother's a lawyer. I'm an economist. And I think to help us to adapt to climate change, there's key issues at the intersection of law and economics. And during my brief 14 minutes of talking without PowerPoint, I want to sketch some of these issues to you. As Jonathan said, I'm here partially to hawk my book. I want to briefly tell you about my book, Adapting to Climate Change, but in the context of some useful remarks. Folks, I think we all agree. I'm reading from my teleprompter. I don't know if we agree on that. I think we all agree that Mother Nature is throwing harder punches at us. But we know this. We know more and more we're understanding and appreciating that climate change poses this ambiguous risk. They used to be unknown unknowns, but things like the Texas freeze in February, the horrible California fires last year, we keep running into these shocks, and unknown unknowns become known unknowns, and some of them are even known knowns. I'll stop with my Rumsfeld. But as risk-averse people become increasingly aware of the tough punches Mother Nature is throwing, risk-averse, prudent people will begin to take steps to adapt. And folks, a theme in some of my free markets work is, of course, this is a challenge, but it also creates opportunities. If we set up our laws and regulations in flexible, smart ways, such that we can better cope with these new shocks we're facing. Building on something Jonathan said a moment ago, in chapter 1 of my book, I discussed the challenge that energy demand in the developing world is going to continue to rise. I'm a fan of many of President Biden's goals in reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but the future growth in global greenhouse emissions will occur in the developing world as they seek a middle-class urban life, as they try to achieve the American dream on their own terms. This makes adaptation a central issue in determining our future quality of life. What I wanted to discuss today in my brief presentation is how do we set up economic incentives and the local rules of the game to accelerate climate change adaptation? And that's a major theme of my book. Folks, the starting point of my book is my teacher, the Nobel laureate Gary Becker's approach to studying people. In Gary Becker's approach, each of us seeks to be healthy, safe, and raise happy, productive children. I hope we can agree on that. I want to be healthy. I want to be safe. And I continue to root for my son, who is an economics major at the University of Chicago. Some things don't change. But each of us has our own conception of the good life. And if we fail to adapt to climate change, all three of these goals, health, safety, and raising the best children we can, are all at risk if we fail to adapt. Part of my optimism about how capitalism helps us to adapt is based on my claim that climate scientists are making progress. We're learning more and more about this moving target, the risks we face from climate change. And as climate science makes progress, investments in satellites, that's a public good. The free market might not do enough of that. But there is the rise of companies like the Jupiter Company, First Street Foundation. There's more and more private sector investment in improvements in climate science to point out new fire zones, new flood risks, areas facing extra heat. A little bit like Paul Revere in America's Past. As we become better educated about the risks we face, prudent people will invest in the self-precautions to protect themselves. And folks, now a key point from economics. If enough people demand solutions, that creates enough aggregate demand to get the attention of an Elon Musk and future entrepreneurs to come up with solutions. My undergraduates at USC and everywhere else I've ever taught always hear my same bad joke. If I were the only bald man in the world, we don't get Rogaine. That's not enough demand to trigger the basic research to create the product. But if enough people have the same challenge facing sea level rise, flood risk, extreme heat, yes, that's a crisis. But for capitalist businesses, that's an opportunity if they can innovate. And something that fascinates me is how much of the risk that Mother Nature is posing to us can be offset through innovation. We see with the COVID virus, of course, it's a calamity, but the vaccinations have been working, of our ability to innovate and to take steps to offset challenges we face. Folks, now a few chapters of the book. So in chapter 3 of the book, I focus on protecting the poor. The poor face the greatest risks from climate change. And this is an essential issue that any free markets proponent has to handle and discuss. Chapter 4 of the book is about upgrading our public infrastructure, of how we do a better job, whether it's the electric grid in Texas or whether it's keeping the electricity grid up, of basic infrastructure for protecting us from risks we face. Chapter 5 discusses how the book is centered on America, but the same issues apply around the world. Chapter 5 focuses on risk to America's companies. How will Amazon's productivity be affected going forward by climate change? If Jeff Bezos' team anticipates this, what steps do they take? Are small businesses more at risk for a variety of reasons, of not having access to capital funding to fund lumpy upfront infrastructure adaptation projects? Which businesses have a comparative advantage in adapting to risk? Chapter 6 discusses urban real estate. What is the future of Miami real estate going forward? The New York Times is publishing weekly articles of the challenges it faces, while at the same time also publishing articles that all these people are moving from New York to Florida because of the new work from home economy. Are the people who are purchasing these expensive homes in Florida taking any steps to offset the new risks they face? My book discusses this. In the back end of the book, I discuss how the rise of spatial big data, improvements in our understanding of the risks we face, will help us to adapt. The final 3 chapters of the book discuss law and regulations that we need to better adapt to climate change. And I'd like to give a couple of examples and then wrap up. It is my opinion that I worry that the federal government and state government could actually slow down climate change adaptation. An example, in California, if insurers are required to continue to insure properties in fire zones at the historical premium prices, that actually discourages taking adaptation steps. The National Flood Insurance Program implicitly subsidizes risk-taking by living in such zones. I am very worried that we need to think harder about the unintended consequences of government muffling capitalist price signals. So in a slight libertarian vision for the future, so John Lennon had that song, Imagine. Imagine a world where water prices reflected scarcity, where flood insurance prices reflected pinpoint risk. Imagine if prices were allowed to reflect scarcity. I claim in that counterfactual world, we would be much better able to adapt to climate change, because those who want to take a risk, they're grown-ups, caveat emptor, but they will have to pay higher costs for that risk and will be incentivized to take greater self-precaution actions because they're on the hook if they locate in a fire zone and their home burns down. That's a very strong incentive to take proper precautions. Folks, one other key piece of law, as I talk about in my book, I want to see land use law change. So much of Los Angeles County is zoned for single-family housing. Imagine a world where Jupiter or other climate science firms pinpoint higher ground, and we change our zoning code to allow for 30-story buildings in those places, in parts of, say, Santa Monica, where it's cooler, which face less sea level rise. If we can identify higher ground, and if we allow developers to have the freedom to build vertically in those places, more middle-class people can afford housing on higher ground, and we avoid the climate gentrification concern. The climate gentrification concern is that in a world with finite safe land, only the rich, only Jeff Bezos will be able to live on higher ground. That would be a horrible world. In my John Lennon Imagine world, we identify those safer parcels of land and we use capital to substitute for land. We build vertically in those places. So I have a vision for a much more flexible capitalism. We identify emerging risks. We educate the public about the risks. So in California, when you purchase a home, you get this earthquake certificate. I want to see something similar for fire zones, sea level rise, to better educate home buyers, potential home buyers, before they spend a lot of money so they're less likely to regret it. I hope that we can configure law and regulation to send proper price signals to people and firms to accelerate our adaptation. And Jonathan, that may be my final point. Oh, one more point. As a University of Chicago economist, I think it's very important to bring back the Coase theorem. Who has property rights here? If we're going to have drought in the West, can farmers sell their scarce water to urbanites? And so my pieces of law here are land use regulation, insurance reform, and change and also road pricing. Maybe we'll come back to that, to create a new capitalism, to configure capitalism to accelerate adaptation, while we're aware that the poor have the least capacity to adapt to these challenges. And we think through how to help the poor because we do face very serious challenges going forward. Jonathan, thank you.
Great, thank you. And just a note to participants, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We will get to your questions very soon. But before that, we're going to turn it over to Professor Craig. Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thanks, Jonathan, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Climate change adaptation is a necessity. Will likely be a necessity for at least a century or more to come. And I'm delighted to be here in the context of Professor Kahn's excellent and thought-provoking book. And Matthew, delighted to hear that we will both be at USC. I want to say, Professor Kahn and I largely agree on the challenges of climate change adaptation. Equity is a huge issue, protecting the poor and the most vulnerable, and it's not just the poor who are vulnerable. We agree that agriculture is a sector that has to have a lot of attention paid to it. We agree that migration is going to prompt a lot of the issues, both economic and legal, that come about because of climate change adaptation. We agree on infrastructure. Infrastructure in many dimensions is going to be a huge part of not only the climate change adaptation picture, but the climate change mitigation picture, and how we cope with that infrastructure will be important. We're also in complete lockstep on some of the perverse things that are happening with insurance and insurance regulation and government's willingness to step in where insurance companies fear to tread. Insurance companies are giving us some of our strongest price signals of when it's time to move and when it's time to engage in other adaptation. And so I completely agree that insurance serves us best by operating without government interference and government takeover. We also agree that better technologies and better use of information will be important. I completely agree, and technological innovation is likely to keep many more people alive, comfortable, happy, safe, all the things that we all want, than lack of innovation. Where I would add some other dimension to this is on the legal side, and a lot of my scholarship is focused on this. Law does need to be more flexible sometimes, but part of the challenge on the law side is determining where more flexibility in the law would really help and where law actually needs to hold the line. And that's a balance that requires some very thoughtful looks at our current legal systems, what we do that needs to be even maybe more strong in the law to restrain things that would become progressively more perverse as climate change progresses, but also I do agree there are aspects of law that do need to be more flexible. Telling the difference is one of the great challenges for scholars across the board. So I will leave that there. I also think that there are limits to what better science can tell us about the future, especially as we approach 2 degrees C of average global warming and beyond. There will be tipping points, there will be threshold crossings that are difficult to predict in advance and difficult to predict what the world will look like on the other side of those crossings. So just something to keep in mind. Jonathan very nicely mentioned my recent, or actually forthcoming article with JB Rule, 4 degrees C. We agree in that economic and market forces will be important aspects of climate change adaptation, and insurance is one of the ones we highlight. Uh, Particularly in the early stages of climate change adaptation, when in situ adaptation is still possible. Things get a little more chaotic when everybody and everything is actively moving and changing location. But Professor Adler asked me to join this conversation to comment on the ways in which law is also critical to climate change adaptation. So I'm going to add 5 thoughts, and these are high-level overarching thoughts of the important roles law is likely to play in climate adaptation broadly in the United States. And I'm happy to get into some more details in our discussion. But first, of course, is infrastructure. And everyone acknowledges infrastructure is going to be changing. Many adaptation measures involve significant infrastructure investment. The high density housing that Professor Kahn advocates. New utilities are going to be necessary to serve migrating populations. People are going to want protective infrastructure like seawalls. And of course, eventually we're going to need to decarbonize the electric grid, all of which are major deals. Private markets may be sufficient to achieve some of this necessary infrastructure adjustment, particularly with regard to housing. But law and regulations are going to continue to be necessary to coordinate infrastructure development. There are more efficient and less efficient ways to go about major infrastructure. And so coordinating function and a planning function will still always reside in the law. And also to protect other values as this development is occurring, including, importantly, the equity values. Tribal rights are something else I would flag. We've seen a lot of infrastructure challenges revolving around tribal rights. And of course, the environment, which I'll get to more in a bit. And I would also note that beyond a certain point, government financing is almost certainly going to be necessary for some of this infrastructure. Some of it is just too big to be done as a purely market mechanism. Second thing I would emphasize is a critically important area for law to manage, law and regulation, is ensuring that climate adaptation doesn't make climate change worse. And there are both synergies and trade-offs between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Some developments serve both. Some climate change adaptation measures, at least potentially, make climate change worse. And that's anything generally that requires more energy. So I will just flag a couple of examples from Professor Kahn's book. He mentions that as things get hotter, people will use more air conditioning. I agree, that's already happening. But depending on what is supplying the electricity for that air conditioning, we may be making climate change worse through that adaptation measure. And that's something that law needs to keep an eye on. It's another argument for decarbonizing the electric grid as fast as we can so that we can have those adaptation measures without making adaptation an even longer process than it's already going to be. He also talks about increased transit speed in cities, again, depending on what is supplying the fuel for all that transportation. We have to be careful about the incentives we create so that we're not making climate change worse at the same time. The third area I would mention that law will provide an important role, continue to provide an important role, is coordinating adaptation strategies. And this is in large part a simple externality problem, but I do ocean and coastal law, so I'll give you the simplest of all examples. Your seawall to protect your property is my eroded beach. And we know that. So coordinating strategies among cities in particular will be important to make sure that adaptation efforts are not actively interfering with each other if different locations choose different adaptation strategies. And that coordination is also going to be important when migration becomes a big deal, because some cities are already expecting to be relocation cities. A lot of the Great Lakes cities are already thinking in these terms, but some aren't. They might not know they're relocation cities. And so coordinating adaptation strategies to help funnel people to cities that are prepared for them, and to give a heads up to cities that they may become destination cities would be a helpful function of law and policy. Um, as we've agreed from the beginning, ensuring equity and protecting the most vulnerable is going to be a continuing important function of law and policy. Professor Kahn acknowledges in his book that purely market systems tend to favor the rich. Correctives to that tends to be through law and policy, such as ensuring that the poorest among us don't get stuck with the most vulnerable housing, ensuring that there are retraining opportunities available, ensuring that we're keeping track of the most vulnerable people, not as in Hurricane Katrina, losing the elderly, losing the sick, forgetting that they can't move themselves, things like that. So some legal law and policies to ensure that we don't leave them behind will be necessary. And then finally, probably where everyone expected me to start, the environment. We need to make sure that the environment doesn't lose out any more than necessary to human adaptation. Economic views of climate change adaptation are anthropocentric. Economics is a human-centered field, and so law and policy have to keep an eye on the aspects of our environment and culture that cannot participate in markets quite as readily. And it's important to remember in climate change adaptation that humans are adapting, but so are species and ecosystems. They're already on the move. And so the more everything is in motion all at once, the more we're going to need government to be keeping an eye on what's happening with all the chess pieces, not just human beings. And so I will close out by just picking a couple of examples, overlapping with Matthew in some respects. But if we think about increased housing, I agree we need to make more housing available. And I agree that zoning changes are going to be necessary to make it happen. And I will also note that Matthew very nicely emphasizes increased density, which I also agree is the way to go. But, you know, if you say, hey, make zoning more flexible to most local governments, they're going to think in terms of sprawl, not in terms of density. And so this is what I mean about that balance between flexibility and keeping a hard line. As we're doing these zoning changes, we need to ensure that they don't result in more sprawl, because that land's going to be valuable for a lot of things, including the environment itself. But even if you go with increased density, even if we avoid sprawl, you've got environmental impacts that are potentially extreme and at least need to be thought about, and government plays the role in ensuring that they're at least thought about. More people in a single location generally means more water use. So you've got to think about where the water's coming from. Do we want water conservation to be built into these new housing developments from the get-go? That usually requires changes in the law as well. More people also potentially means more water pollution. At the very least, more sewage and more need for sewage treatment and more potential for sewage discharges when we get the huge, stronger storms that are projected under climate change. You have to worry about increased air pollution and local air pollution issues, and then increased density in cities, if you don't think about it ahead of time, also creates heat island effect, which nobody needs when the planet is warming anyway. Second example I'll throw out, because not a whole lot of people think about it, but I do, is the abandoned infrastructure problem. So as people are moving, there will be infrastructure that is left behind. A lot of that infrastructure will be toxic. Very few buildings are toxic free. And so we have to think about the decommissioning side of infrastructure, which is not really present in law outside of the mining context. Not a whole lot of requirements for decommissioning. Military bases also have some decommissioning requirements, but otherwise not something we think about as being necessary for quote unquote normal infrastructure because it's valuable. Why would anyone just abandon it? Well, people will be just abandoning it if we leave it up in the air. And that abandoned infrastructure takes up space that's valuable for species. This is why it's in the environment section. Potentially valuable for species, migrating species, potentially valuable as farmland if it's not too toxic, potentially valuable as land necessary for the renewable energy structures we need. So if it has value in an economic sense, I agree with Professor Kahn. We may need to see new markets develop about the decommissioning of these old buildings. If it's most valuable as habitat, maybe not. But either way, the law needs to think about what we're going to do about the abandoned infrastructure so that we don't lose resources that are valuable for our evolving environments and for our evolving land use needs in the process. And with that, I will end my remarks and open it up, hopefully, to a more robust discussion.
Great, thank you. Just before we go to questions from the audience, and I will, of course, take moderator's prerogative to ask questions of my own. Professor Kahn, I didn't know if you had any initial responses that you wanted to give on Professor Craig's remarks.
I'm really happy that we're going to be colleagues. I am going to learn from my new colleague. Jonathan, let's open up. I'm going to speak offline to Robin. I wrote down all of her comments.
Well, I guess was one question initially off the bat that I'd love to get both of your response to is, a lot of the discussion about adaptation in a market context is assuming market actors that are responding to market incentives more so than, say, political incentives. But when we're talking about the electric grid, when we're talking about electric provision, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're often talking about utilities. And as we know from the fire experience in California, the incentives that rate-regulated utilities face, the way they approach risks, the way financial risks are internalized for both management and investors are different than they are for the private firm in a competitive market. And I'm wondering if either you have thoughts on how we deal with that, because certainly the argument has been made that, say, a company like PG&E doesn't approach fire risk the way Amazon might, because they're operating in a rate-regulated environment where they have a guaranteed return, and that may distort their incentives. And yet a company like PG&E is going to be a major player, or be a very important player in, say, how California adapts to both changes in demand for energy and electricity in particular, but also how California adapts to the changing risks presented by climate change itself, including most notably fire risk, but certainly that's not the only one.
So briefly, but I love this question. As an empiricist, the paper that I want to write with a lawyer here is to take a look at the composition of each state's public utility commission. And are the members of the commission, is there increased representation of resilience-focused individuals? And I realize that's vague. I love your point that PG&E faces more constraints on its profit maximization problem than Amazon. The devil's in the details of working out. Jonathan, my comparative static would be if the Public Utility Commission begins to upweight the importance of resilience, PG&E will start to take steps to weatherize its infrastructure. They'll start to have these rolling blackouts across California to reduce wildfire risk. Jonathan, a point I didn't make in my presentation is I want PG&E to sign up more customers for critical peak pricing. I want them to use prices, not quotas, to get to reduce aggregate demand during peak times. And so I take your point that for those private actors whose profitability depends on public sector interactions, I think we do need a new economics there, but it's crucial who is the median voter within the Public Utility Commission.
And I will just add, yes, I think we need to rethink utilities in several respects. The fact that we have above ground power lines might be a technological decision we might question in the future. Above ground power, I mean, Salt Lake City, where I am at the moment, largely got rid of its above ground power lines because there's a lot of risks here with having above ground power lines. And I think the fires are demonstrating that maybe that's a technological option we allow now that we might need to rethink in the future. If you're thinking in terms of nimbleness, we often think about utilities on 30 to 50 year timescales, and that's how their rate of return is calculated. Maybe utility regulations at a higher level need to be thinking in terms of more nimble utilities, where in certain locations at least we're not allowing or not encouraging building on that sort of a time scale when we know this is an area that is likely to be abandoned or likely have far less population by the far before the end of that life cycle. So I think there's a lot that needs to be rethought. This might sound like heresy, and this is one of the areas where I think we had an experiment with monopolies, we had an experiment with free markets. I don't think anyone is satisfied that we've achieved yet the best balance between those two. But in a time of transition, thinking about what the best Uber model of utilities is, whether there are some advantages to going back to a more monopoly looking structure or not, is something that needs to be thought through again, because utilities in a changing world are different than utilities where you can make reasonable projections about population growth, population leaving. So I'm not saying I know what the answer to that question is, but I think assuming that we have developed the best general model once and for all is probably a faulty assumption.
Another question I have is, in the book, Professor Kahn highlights the dynamic nature of markets, the ability to incorporate information and respond to that information, and that in many respects, climate change presents risks that competitive firms seek to address, like any other sort of risks. And that dynamism is a source of flexibility and a source of responsiveness. In the law, we often view dynamism as itself at times a source of risk, in the sense that we often like law to provide a certain degree of predictability and a certain degree of stasis. A lot of legal doctrines place a lot of weight on reliance interests. And I guess a question of Professor Kahn, and again, Professor Craig wants to comment on this as well, is do we have to let go? Do the lawyers have to let go of our desire for certainty? And I guess, in the ecological context, something that might relate to that is that there are some legal instruments, like say conservation easements, which are very static in the way we treat them, in the sense that for a conservation easement to be recognized and for you to get the tax benefits of it and so on, it has to be permanent, which means if the species that a conservation easement was designed to protect today migrates, there's no way to extinguish that easement, recapture and use that as the basis for financing a new easement where the species has moved to. Does this mean that we have to be telling our clients, yes, we know you want predictability and stability, but we're in a dynamic a world now. Stationarity is dead. We need to embrace dynamism more fully.
Jonathan, one smart answer and brief answer. In my discussions with Paul Romer, when he was at work on the Charter Cities project, as you know, with Charter Cities, this was about new rules. If we created new cities by scratch, what would be their rules? And Jonathan, can we agree that that would be the right experiment of if we could create some charter cities, what laws, with our knowledge in 2021, with what Greta Thunberg has taught us, with what we now know going forward, when we haven't locked into durable capital and rules in these cities we would build from scratch, what rules would they have? So, Jonathan, if we observe that, would that be the right treatment control comparison to see what we're losing from our current stasis in the law as you sketched it?
Might work. I mean, I guess one concern is, do we have the time to run the experiment? But
Right.
certainly that's one question, and certainly insofar as some adaptation is occurring at the state and local level, we at least have some ability to observe what different jurisdictions are doing and learn from those actions that are successful. But it's not, we don't have the opportunity to keep rerunning the experiment, of course.
And I would just throw into this that there's a couple of things. First, there are some base aspects of the American legal system that everyone assumes are not going to change, i.e., we will be a democracy, we will be a capitalist system, we were not going to change the currency suddenly, there's already a set of assumptions built in that are so built in that people take them for granted. And one of the things JB and I raise in 4 Degrees C is maybe as things get worse and worse, some of those are maybe not assumptions we should consider so inviolable that they won't change. But the other thing is scale. And so, as people are being nimble and reacting to what's going on now, they're not always thinking about how their current reaction plays out in the long term. And I think that's one of the real difficulties of climate change and thinking about nimbleness. And again, just to use the coastal example, people want to build seawalls right now. That's in nobody's long-term best interest for the coast. And so the fact that people can be nimble, can act quickly, doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a pause point to think, okay, but what adaptation pathway does this cut off in the future for the future? What problem might this cause as things continue to progress? And so that, I think, is another aspect of the nimbleness issue that's important to keep in mind. And as we all know from politics, what you do in any 2-year or 4-year cycle isn't necessarily what you would have wanted 10 years in the future. So that's an important dynamic to keep in mind as well.
One other question that was raised in the Q&A box and that has already come up a little bit is, how do we think about how to accelerate adaptation for not merely non-market actors, but the species and the ecosystems? And I'd be curious if Professor Kahn has some more thoughts on that. Is that simply a question of hoping that nonprofits and wealthy philanthropists fund the sort of adaptive measures we need for ecosystem protection and species? Is it something that we just have to rely upon governments and other non-market actors to be involved in? Are there, what are the lessons? Put it another way, are the lessons in your book purely about those of us that are acting and producing in markets, or to what extent can they extend to the other things that we care about and that we're hoping to preserve, which certainly include species and ecosystems?
Two quick points, but I want to hear from Professor Craig on this issue. In the last chapter of my book, I do a little bit of a survey of ecology, where I talk about how different creatures are migrating in response to their changing ecosystem. Jonathan, entities like land trusts, like the Nature Conservancy, as their leaders anticipate the climate change challenge, as they think about the geography of where creatures are trying to get to, if they purchase more adjacent parcels of land and can create, I don't want to call it a zoo, but a nature park where these creatures can be safe, their children can live, and that they can be healthy. This is this interface of free market environmentalism and Terry Anderson's vision. Jonathan, we're going to have to overcome the free rider issue. The Nature Conservancy is going to have to tell its story of what will be the ecological gains from these creatures having their own higher ground. But that would, without overdoing it, that would be a free market vision for how to use private land markets to protect vulnerable creatures.
And I'll throw into that, there are, again, law can play a role in guiding, and there's been some creative interpretations of the Endangered Species Act that would help there. There's a lot of scientific work that indicates that protecting corridors rather than static places is probably the best way to help species. But there's also been work done in riparian areas that environmental amenities increase land value. They're also important to human adaptation. I mean, having a nice environment within and around the city is important for a lot of things. It helps with air pollution, it keeps the city cooler, it keeps people saner, all of which are important aspects of climate change adaptation. There is a field of ecosystem services trying to connect the economic value of these environmental amenities to an actual market. It's not always possible, but I don't think near enough has been done in that realm to try and capture some of these very basic economic values of keeping the environment in place. And I would hope that some of the creative economists would work with the biologists and the people, like I said, trying to keep people sane in these denser, hotter cities is going to be a psychological aspect of climate change that we have to think about. There's got to be a synergy in there and finding ways to make it work, finding ways to capture that value in land markets is a possible way to bridge law and economics. I don't think you can do all of the conservation you want through markets, but I think there certainly could be a larger part of the conservation in changing times that's based on markets.
Jonathan, can I jump in and ask you guys a question? So Robin's getting ready to move to Los Angeles, and the great Donald Shoup, UCLA's great urban planner, has done great work of that there's too much parking in Los Angeles because there's rules requiring parking. Robin, going back to John Lennon and the song Imagine, in a world where there's more ride sharing, I think we can agree we're going to need less parking. If there was less parking in LA, that would liberate land to address the urban heat island effect and could allow for more housing to be built. In that simple example, as professional lawyers and academics, are you optimistic that the urban law will change, or could Don Schutz be disappointed for the next 25 years? I hope that's a well-posed question.
It is, and I grow frustrated every time the University of Utah puts in a new parking lot because we actually have a decent transportation system in the city. You know, I grew up in Southern California. I worked for a part of my life at Disneyland. I always wanted the monorail. I mean, I want the monorail everywhere. If I were in charge for a month, I would get mass public transit, especially in Los Angeles, going. It's gotten better since I last lived there, but you know, we shouldn't be encouraging individual cars, even if we manage to make them all electric, zero emission vehicles. Just the congestion, and again, I harp on this, but it's a often neglected part of climate change adaptation. The psychological aspect of having to get up and face, fight traffic every moment or every morning, because there's parking at the other end. I think that's one of the less examined aspects of climate change adaptation that we should be paying more attention to. And yes, less parking for a lot of reasons, but it has to be matched by a public transportation system that's available to all, convenient for all, and not contributing to climate change, all those other things. So yes, but many other changes have to occur to get rid of the parking, because the incentive of not driving doesn't work if there's no other way to get to where you're going. So
I guess a somewhat related question, I guess, is how much should we think about part of adaptation being the enactment of policies that alter the incentives faced by market actors? So just to focus on cities, for example, one thing that can help, especially with the urban heat island effect, is to change what we do with surfaces. If we're talking about parking, maybe parking should be underground. That's a vertical issue, but our roofs should probably not be blacktop, right? They should, here on campus, we have one of our most recent buildings has a grass roof. It's a LEED certified building, and if you get an aerial view, it's green, and that's has tremendous benefits. But those benefits aren't accrued by, or aren't usually fully accrued by or captured by the builder of the building or the occupants of the building. They are instead more dispersed. To what extent should we be hoping and expecting local governments or state governments or whomever to be changing the rules in a way that create greater incentives for these sorts of developmental changes that have help with adaptation more broadly?
Jonathan, one thought there, and you're making a very important point about externalities. Imagine in an economy, mayors care about their property tax base. And if quality of life is threatened by climate change, and I think we all agree that it is, if those cities with great quality of life have higher real estate values, that means more property tax revenue for the mayor. If climate change threatens that tax base, then that mayor collects less revenue. Jonathan, in a book I'm going to publish next year, I argue that the rise of work from home going forward will make our economies footloose, even more footloose, and that they're going to run away from places with low quality of life. So a point that I've been making for 15 years is that cities with great quality of life, the mayor can sleep well because there will be a strong tax base. If what you're talking about, the urban heat island effect, pollution, stress, congestion, if this lowers quality of life, real estate prices fall, the mayor has a lower tax base. That would be my incentives logic for why the mayor might wake up and take some of these issues seriously and incentivize those green roofs like Case Western.
I would agree. I think there's both law aspects to it. So building codes, there are a lot of perverse incentives in a lot of building codes. That building you see behind me required a change in the health code so that we could use water in some innovative ways to cool the building. And you know, so there's things that need to be looked for, things that needed to be added. There's also a social normalization part of this that's hard to define and hard to produce either through economics or law. But if it becomes expected that you will have a nice rooftop garden or more green infrastructure, you know, pavement that allows for water infiltration, all that fun stuff, there's a social dimension to what becomes desirable, what becomes expected, as well as a law in economics. And the last thing I will just throw in, one of the last visits I had to San Francisco, turns out there's now a map in the Bay Area of buildings that have really cool rooftop gardens. And those buildings are recapturing some of the economic value of that because they're tourist destinations and there's usually a cafe or someplace you can spend money and whatnot. So I think there are other creative mechanisms that might come out. You know, if you get a city that has a rooftop garden competition of some sorts, people respond to different kinds of incentives. And so again, you know, my main point is I don't know that I have the answers, but thinking far more creatively than we do, I think will benefit everyone in the long run.
Jonathan, if I could pick up on that, I think that's one of my themes as well, is sort of a celebration of Hayek. My book does not offer all the answers. I think as readers, you know that. That was a half joke. But of how capitalism helps to unleash the wisdom of crowds as we seek out solutions. The world's a big place. There's 7.4 billion of us. What's the best idea out there? And how do we discover this and then this idea to diffuse through our modern social media?
And also, and one thing I would add, a neat a business venture that I saw a pitch for, which relates to the rooftop garden idea, but also the desire for farm to table and local produce, is the development of more advanced technologies for rooftop greenhouses and rooftop gardens for restaurants, so that they can offer diners the benefits of fresh, local, truly local, coming from upstairs produce and the like, but done in ways that also improve what's being improves more broadly the effects of the business of the building on the local environment and the like. So folks are aware, Professor Kahn has been multitasking. He's answered some questions in the Q&A box as well for those that have typed in some questions. One that I wanted to flag, and I was going to ask him to elaborate on, is apparently this idea that Ed Glazer has proposed, tying access to federal infrastructure transfers to changing local zoning laws. The Kahn law part of me is imagining all sorts of commandeering and coercive spending hypotheticals for a Kahn law exam, but I'm wondering if you want to unpack that idea a little bit more as a way the federal government might encourage adaptation at the local level.
So what Ed Glazer was discussing is localities have property rights here. The Coase theorem teaches us when an entity has property rights, you have to make them a deal to purchase that implicit or explicit property right. So Ed Glazer, my brilliant friend at Harvard, was arguing, he did not give specifics in his New York Times piece, but it's a brilliant idea that in a world where President Biden is getting ready to spend trillions, that may be enough money to nudge some local governments to bundle transfers from the feds with changes in local land use to achieve many of the Biden administration's goals. Jonathan, we have a housing affordability issue in cities such as Los Angeles. We have a climate change adaptation challenge. We have a homelessness challenge in Los Angeles. Robin is moving to a great city, but a city with challenges. The brilliance of Glazer's suggestion is this bundling of federal money, hopefully federal human capital and oversight, but requiring no free lunch, requiring some policy reform. And Jonathan, I think this requires much more work, but it's an optimistic Coasian vision for getting to policy reform.
Let's say living here in Cleveland, where those of you that have been downtown in Cleveland know we have several blocks of just surface parking lots in what is prime downtown real estate, and interests that benefit from the maintenance of that, and dislodging that is very hard. And that's certainly more broadly dislodging those interests that benefit from the status quo is certainly one of the challenges that we're going to face in encouraging adaptation. We have reached the top of the hour. There's certainly so much more we could talk about, drawing on Professor Kahn's book and Professor Craig's work on legal aspects of adaptation. But please join me in virtually thanking them for their comments today. We certainly appreciate that. For those of you that are here for the CLE, I will be showing the CLE code in a moment. The link for the CLE evaluation form is in the chat. Please fill that out within 48 hours. And I'm about to give the activity code. But once again, please join me in thanking Professors Kahn and Craig. Hopefully we will have them back here at some point again in person. But we were thrilled they were able to spend this hour with us today virtually. Thank you both. I look forward to seeing both of you again in person in the not too distant future. Have a safe move, I guess both of you, to USC, and we look forward to seeing your future work and your future collaborations on this and related issue. But thank you both.